Many dead languages have active and vibrant neo-communities of people in the modern era making new compositions in old languages. You don't have to go far on the internet to find people giving speeches in ancient Greek, playing video games in Latin, or writing poetry in Sanskrit. The Old English neo-community is unfortunately not very strong. It's growing, but we don't have the prestige of ancient Greek or the discursive tradition of Latin, or the widespread popularity and institutional support of either. While a language like Latin has tens of thousands of comfortable speakers worldwide, in Old English we probably have less than 500 people who could form lucid sentences. What we do have is J.R.R. Tolkien. The professor was a passionate student, teacher, and lover of Old English. To the chagrin of his colleagues, he was not the most productive scholar, but that's because he spent most of his free time on his creative projects, many of which were related to or even in Old English. It's hard to overstate how cool this is. In a language like Latin, modern composition is nothing new, it's barely even a dead language. That is, there hasn't been a day on the earth in the last 2,500 years where no one has spoken Latin. But in Neo-Old English, before Tolkien, there was almost nothing. Aside from a few educational products and half-hearted attempts, no one was even trying to write in Old English, much less as anything more than a curiosity. Tolkien was the first person to take it seriously. He is unironically the founder of the Neo-Old English community. That said, as anyone interested in ancient languages can tell you, it's not easy to do this well. Given that there is no native speaker there to correct you, it's really difficult to avoid mistakes and to compose something that's actually faithful to the original language. Case in point, the scarce few examples of Neo-Old English before Tolkien are frankly gibberish. As a pioneer, therefore, we should excuse Tolkien if his writings were error-ridden or anachronistic, and you might be wondering, are they actually any good? Oh yeah, I won't beat around the bush. Tolkien isn't just the first member of this community, he's probably still the best. This stuff is amazing. In today's video, I'll show you 3 of Tolkien's Old English compositions, read a bit from each one, and do my best to explain what was probably going on inside his head while writing them. Stay tuned. Number 1. The Annals of Beleriand. As anyone who has read the History of Middle-earth series will know, Tolkien's Legendarium originally centered around the events of what we now consider to be the Silmarillion, and the conflict between Morgoth and the elves over the gems forged by Fëanor, that is, the Silmarils. Especially when he was first developing these stories, he made several attempts to connect the material somehow to early medieval England, and the first couple books of the History of Middle-earth series feature a lot of these references, many of which cast the events being discussed as being reported on by an Anglo-Saxon named Ælfscyne, who visits the elves and records their mythology. A couple of these writings take shape as chronicles, which were terse and matter-of-fact bullet points on important events popular in the Old English period. Here's a selection from one of these chronicles, written in Old English, allegedly by the hand of Ælfscyne. 2000 on hun teuni, oth 2000 on 200, unudun tha tellere on anetie. 2000 on 200, her komon tha tellere oth godedel. 2000 on 500. Her thorch sarukraft as a thochton on beworchton tha noldilve jimmas missenliche, on Fëanor nolden hlávord worchte tha silmarillas, that waron erkonstanas. There's kind of a shiver I get when I read Tolkien's Old English, not just because of how cool it is, but also because of how good it is. If not for the obviously elvish proper names, I actually think that a native speaker might assume this to be authentic. Allow me to point out a few reasons why. Immediately, the style of presentation stands out as being very faithful to the tradition that it's mimicking. Here is a random selection from an actual Old English chronicle. You'll see little things like the word and being written with what looks like a 7 to us. This was a common scribal tradition in Old English. The entries are also characteristically terse and begin with the word her, which literally means here. On a higher level, it would have been really easy for a scholar of Old English to name the tellery something like the telleras, using the as ending, the most common ending for masculine nouns, and what we use nowadays for proper nouns like Danes and Swedes. But Tolkien correctly casts it as tellere here, as what's called an I-stem noun. These nouns were rare, except when referring to groups of people, and even though we say Danes nowadays, in Old English it was Dane. Even though we say elves nowadays, in Old English it was Ylve. It wouldn't have been a mistake per se if he had used as and cast it as what we would call an a-stem noun, which is again the most common type of noun in Old English, commonly used in proper names, but Tolkien knew that the most accurate option was an I-stem noun, and his decision reflects his familiarity with Old English onomastics. Another thing that you'd only learn through familiarity with the actual literature of Old English is the tendency to and method of translating proper names from other languages. Here is a random passage from an Alvrich homily. Mattheus ta se apostol shop thare chirichan noman resurrectio, that is, arist. We still do this in modern English, but the formula used to be different. You say the foreign word, you say that is or that was, and then the native equivalent. Here, for Silmarils, Tolkien supplies Erklandstanas, a word meaning precious stones, also the source for his word Arkenstone. The Old English here, that waron, literally that were, sounds strange to us. Our modern English instincts would tell us to either say that is or those were in that situation. But Tolkien actually has it right. This is the correct way to say it in Old English. That waron appears over 90 times in the corpus. You can find the full chronicles and other Old English texts in Shaping of Middle-earth, the 4th volume of the History of Middle-earth series. I'll have the link to that in the description. Number 2. Sellic Spell. The next work I'd like to talk about is Sellic Spell, which is Tolkien's attempt to write the fairy tale that he thought Beowulf might have been based on. I have a couple disagreements with the decisions he makes here, and I have another video on that if you're interested, but the Old English itself is very, very good. Here's a random example. Hine men michlis wyrne taldon, leiton hine for hane, nene rymdon him nane settlont as kyningis halle, ac he wunode on hyrne. Here he is switching between loosely quoting Beowulf and filling in the gaps with his own prose. The first few words, for example, are really just a reordering of Beowulf lines 2183 to 87, but after that he shows a couple things that you would have to know English pretty well to come up with. This construction leiton hine for hane, which I translate as they took him for a good-for-nothing, is pretty rare and only appears a couple times in the entire Old English corpus. Here is another example from Augustine's soliloquies. You'll see here that the construction consists of using the verb laton and the preposition for with an accusative. You might have noticed that this actually sort of survives into modern English, but we changed the verb. Now we say, what do you take me for, as opposed to what do you let me for. So if someone were writing this fairy tale and wanted to express they took him for a good-for-nothing in Old English, we really wouldn't be able to blame them if they used a verb that actually means to take, like niman or takan, or if they just gave up altogether and said something like, they thought he was a loser. It would take a serious knowledge of Old English to know that this construction actually does exist, and that's exactly what Tolkien had. It's also remarkable to see him use words like hyrne, meaning corner, decades before any sort of resource was even published, much less digitized, that would allow him to actually search for Old English words based on their meaning. My guess is that he actually saw it in a compound somewhere, like hyrnstan, meaning cornerstone, which explains why he actually makes a small error here and declines the noun as strong when it should be weak. That is, hyrne is what we call a feminine weak noun, meaning that in this instance he actually should have written on hyrnan. But he'd have no way of knowing that unless he had actually seen it used that way in a text, and because it's such a rare word, he probably just never did. You might be wondering now, does Tolkien ever make mistakes in his Old English? The answer is, of course, yes, but they're so rare that finding one is like finding a four-leaf clover. I'll show you another example that I found. In this sentence, the king asks Beowulf who he is, but there's a slight problem here. This word hwa is where we get the word who from, but the usage isn't exactly the same, and in Old English, hwa was only used in questions where the subject was completely unknown. Take this line from the poem Solomon and Saturn. Hwa darthon ne druchne daemon. Who dares then to judge the Lord? The who is completely unknown. They don't know anyone who dares to judge the Lord. But the way to ask someone right in front of you, who are you, is not hwa arthu, it's hwat arthu, literally what are you, which appears over 30 times in the corpus. Take this example from The Vengeance of the Savior. As you can see, it's not hwa, but hwat used here. And the three words hwa arthu actually never appear together anywhere in Old English, so we got him. We found a mistake. That said, Christopher Tolkien tells us multiple times that these texts were written off the cuff without constant reference to anything, certainly not the extensive digital resources that we're lucky to have today. He was going off the top of his head, so the paucity of errors is insanely impressive. You can read the entirety of his Sellic Spell book at the end of his Beowulf translation. The link for that will be in the description. Along with his understanding of the linguistics of Old English, Tolkien's works can also verge into being almost cultural compositions, wherein he experiments with mimicking entire aspects of the Old English world. Here's my friend James to talk a bit about this.
Thanks, Graham. Alongside his prose works, Tolkien also left behind many notes which contain translations of Elvish personal and place names into Old English. And one note that really stands out to me is a genealogical table for what would have become in the published Silmarillion the House of Finwë. In the earliest versions of the Legendarium, Finwë was simply called Finn, and based on an Old English name that was applied to the Noldor elves, Thafinningas, it seems that this name was taken directly into Old English without being translated. You might recognise this name from Graham's videos. The Battle of Finnsburg is a Germanic legend referenced by Beowulf, in which Finn was a king of the Frisians. It wouldn't be the first Elvish name borrowed from Old English. Eärendil was an Old English word before Tolkien invented an Elvish etymology for it, but we have nothing from his notes to confirm this for Finn. Now, if you put all of these names into a family tree, one thing that will immediately catch your eye is how often Finn appears as an element in them. And this will be familiar to Tolkien and anyone who's had a look into the Anglo-Saxon royal genealogies. The East Saxons are rather fond of names that begin with Sia, and Alfred the Great's siblings were called Æthelstan, Æthelswith, Æthelbald, Æthelbert, and Æthelred. This abundance of Finn names is something that's true in the Elvish as well, and in fact many of Tolkien's quote-unquote translations seem to be him picking from the list of Anglo-Saxon name elements the ones which sound most like their Elvish names. Hence we have Fingold for Fingolfin, Finred for Finrod, Inglar for Inglor, and Earngrim for Aegnor. But there are some notable exceptions to this. Fëanor and his two older sons have names which sound totally unlike their Elvish ones. The Bros in Fëanor's name comes from the Brosingas. There are people who are mentioned in Beowulf as the makers of a certain mena, which is a type of necklace or torque. Some scholars also link them to the necklace of Freyja in Norse mythology, which is called the Brisingamen. This is just about all the information we get on the Brosingas, and so who they are exactly is unknown to us, but Tolkien here has woven this legendary Germanic item into his own mythology through the construction of Fëanor's Old English name. The origin of Maethros and Maglor's names are less clear. Daired is an attested word in Old English that means dawn or daybreak, and the second element is usually derived as coming from the colour red. Christopher Tolkien tentatively links this with Maethros's red hair, which is what the Ross part of his name means, but how day would translate the first half is puzzling. Though with how early on Tolkien made these Old English translations, it could be that he intended Maethros to mean dawn in Elvish at this point. We know from his notes that Tolkien changed his mind at least once, modifying the English translation of Maethros from pale glitter to handsome ginger. Diamond for Maglor is similarly confusing. It is notable that Tolkien decided to use the same word in the names of both brothers, when their Elvish names clearly do not. The law in Maglor, or laure as it is in Quenya, means gold, but as a poetic word for the colour, not the metal, compare laurelin, one over two trees. Perhaps dye translates this in the sense of the golden light of day, and the meaning of mag is not something that Tolkien properly explained, so Old English mund, meaning hand or protector, could be a translation of it. Finally, there wasn't really the concept of a surname in Old English, but people might be given bynames, which usually reference something like a prominent physical feature or their job. There are several bynames given in this tree, and their meanings will make sense to anyone who knows this area of the Legendarium well, but I will leave translating them as an exercise to the viewer. Back to you, Graham.
And for all my students watching this, that translation exercise was not a joke. I will be grading your answers next class. Number 3, Ides Ælfscyne. This last piece is the most interesting to me. It's a rhyming poem, and what Tom Shippey refers to as one of Tolkien's trapped mortal poems, wherein a human, typically a man, is sort of enchanted and or spirited away by some being, typically a woman, with supernatural qualities. The most mature and well-developed version of this motif is of course the story of Beren and Luthien, which Tolkien explicitly acknowledges to be about his relationship with his wife, Edith. This poem seems to be a bit different from that, and I'm not really sure what to make of it. Certainly the Old English is excellent. It's worth noting that there is of course no sort of dictionary in which he can search up rhyming words in Old English or anything like that. It's all coming directly from his head, and it's consistently high quality. For example, he knows that the correct way to say that someone is boarding a boat in Old English is to use the construction stigan on with accusative. But really, on the whole, I'm not quite sure how to interpret this poem, so I want to leave it up to you. Happily, Tolkien actually wrote himself that he intended the poem to be sung to the tune of Tight Little Island, a British folk song. I've given my best shot then at performing this song to the lyre, and I'll play the text next to a translation so you can follow along as it goes. The translation is by Tom Shippey, and you can find the full poem and more in his book The Road to Middle-earth. The link to that will be in the description. Enjoy.
Tha ich was knicht, tha komit on plicht, som meiden me mette und malde. La leuva wees hal, shall unkerje dal, nu navre ma werthan on erthan. No ma werthan on erdan, no ma werthan on erdan, wa Ides Ælfscyne, ond wa Winamine, shall navre ma werthan on erdan. Heu kyste me sona, där likste Simona, on klommum me klipte on salde, on ovste me nom, mir hire under glom, där shall du gong avre was wavre. Wal mi stavre was wavre, wal mi stavre was wavre, wa Ides Ælfscyne, ond wa Winamine, där shall du gong avre was wavre. Waar hit each nacht, weest die on bad, daar moernen de mere ond malme, over lagu each lath, ond modes each math, ac avre me strongo de longath. Awa strongo de longath, awa strongo de longath, wa Ides Ælfscyne, ond wa Winamine, daar avre me strongo de longath. Der grene was grund, und wheat ihre hund, und gilden was wate on halme, und fyrlenum londe, und silverenum stronde, der daro de dwerg under bergum, daro de dwerg under bergum, daro de dwerg under bergum, wa Ides Ælfscyne, und wa Winamine, der daro de dwerg under bergum. To gode Ichibad, el feudum gesad, be dimmum ondreuricum warum, daar sunden e shan, ac Michel jim stan, on liefdet gleu mit his leumum. Leuchte gleu mit his leumum, leuchte gleu mit his leumum, wa Ides Ælfscyne, und wa Winamine, on liefdet gleu mit his leumum. Over misere hund, each wadla on wound, ef de to menische ond magum, on mold on was nu, saith the kude me you, ond har each nu wanie ana, sare wanie ana, sare wanie ana, wa Ides Ælfscyne, ond wa Winamine, ond har each nu wanie ana.